Getting religion, faith, culture, and politics from the age of Eisenhower to the era of Obama. In today's Tribune, Barbara Mahaney writes that Woodward delivers a live jolt to the heart and soul. No writer has ever made the latter half of the 20th century so captivatingly readable. You'll laugh, you'll wince, you'll mark the book as a keeper. Discussing this book today are Professor Martin Marty and the author Kenneth Woodward. Professor Marty hails from West Point, Nebraska. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1956 and served as a Lutheran pastor from 1952 to 1967 in the suburbs of Chicago. From 1963 to 1998, he taught at the University of Chicago Divinity School, eventually holding the endowed chair Fairfax M. Cohen Distinguished Service Professorship. He holds emeritus status at the University of Chicago. Professor Marty has received numerous honors, including the National Humanities Medal, the Medal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the University of Chicago Alumni Medal, and the Order of Lincoln Medallion, the highest honor Illinois bestows. In addition, 80 different honorary doctorates. Professor Marty has published an authored book or an edited book for every year he was a full-time professor. He has maintained that same authorial pace in his retirement. In addition, he has authored over 5,000 articles and many more incidental pieces. In May of this year, Paraclete Press published his most recent book with the title that may frighten some of us in the room. October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther and the Day That Changed the World. Kenneth L. Woodward edited Newsweek's religion section from 1964 until 2002. A native of Cleveland, Ohio, Woodward graduated with honors from Notre Dame University in 1957. Over the years, Woodward has lectured at over 40 colleges and universities. In 1993, he was Regents Visiting Professor in the Religious Studies Department at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Woodward has contributed numerous articles and book reviews to publications such as Commonweal, America, The Critic, McCall's, GEO, Smithsonian, The New York Times, and Washington Post. Woodward is co-author with the child psychiatrist Arthur Kohnhaber, MD, of Grandparents, Grandchildren, The Vital Connection, a study of the three-generation family. More recently, Making Saints, How the Catholic Church Determines Who Becomes a Saint, Who Doesn't, and Why. The Book of Miracles, The Meaning of Miracle Stories in Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam. But as to tonight's book, I'm going to start by asking Professor Marty. In the preface of your most recent book, you quote approvingly the philosopher Eugen Rostock Hussy's observation that all good books are about one thing. What is this book's one thing?
Okay. It sounds strange, am I on? It sounds strange to say one book is about one thing, but an encyclopedia has a lot of things, and dictionaries have a lot of things. But if I say dictionary, you know exactly what it's about. And if the author can't make up her mind, the reader isn't going to make it. If you've ever read a good novel or anything like that, you can really, it's in your system. So what is this book about? This book is about the tumultuous time that religion had and enacted and has and is enacting since the Eisenhower Era at mid-century. Yeats' great poem, Things Fall Apart, the Center Cannot Hold, and I think Ken is really, really good at grasping all the ways what happens when things splinter, when everything had been embedded and intact, and now it's splintered. It didn't go away, it just took a different form.
Ken, did you get it right?
I like his definition. I think it works out really well. When I was writing the book, I told myself I am writing a social history of the second half of the 20th century that takes religion from the periphery of the narrative, where most history books put it, and puts it at the center. It also coincides with my lifespan. So I knew that if I was to write about the 40s and 50s and my children and grandchildren were going to get it, I would have to animate it from the inside, give you a sense of what it felt like to be alive then. In the 50s, for those of you who may not know this, I think you might agree, institutionally and in terms of influence, religion was more powerful than in any other decade. And the institutions were very strong. For example, half the Catholic school-aged children were in Catholic schools. If you were a pollster and you took the pulse, you found that 98% of people said they believed in God. And they were in the churches and they were in the synagogues, weren't the Muslims here at the time. They built more houses of worship, more churches, more synagogues in the 50s than at any time before or since. The Protestant divinity schools, the seminaries, could pick and choose. And the kinds of people that went there, I am told, were people whose other options were to be a doctor, or to be a lawyer, or a captain of industry. That's the level of society from which they drew. Catholic families were still larger than most other folks, maybe the Mormons, and there was still that idea that if you had a large enough family, one boy would go to the priesthood, one would go to the daughter would go to become a nun. The religiosity of the groups was matched by the religiosity of the Eisenhower era. I suppose if you went into any church or synagogue, you saw a flag, or American flag there, and some flag representing the religion. The Republican Party, and I listened for those of you who thought that George Bush Jr. was a theocrat. In the 1950s, the Republican National Committee declared that President Eisenhower was not only president of the country, not only commander-in-chief, but the spiritual leader of the country. Imagine that today.
Top scholar of Eisenhower's religion said he had a very fervent faith and a very vague religion.
Well, there's a line that I use from Gene McCarthy. He said, in Washington, the only kind of religion that's tolerated is vague beliefs strongly affirmed and strong beliefs vaguely expressed. And the latter was certainly, was Eisenhower.
Now, getting to the nub of the book, one of the points you make that sort of sums up a lot of what you say in the book is that how you get religion determines what religion you get.
Yeah, it's the conditions under which you get religion, you receive religion. If you look at the chapter headings, the word Protestant, Catholic, or Jew does not appear there, but other kinds of phrases do. For example, the way most of us, those of us who got religion, most of us get it through family, neighborhood institutions, where you live mattered a lot. We didn't bring that map, did we?
We didn't.
We forgot your map. There was a wonderful map published by the Religious Atlas of America, Historical Atlas of Religion in America. And it showed that if you lived in, let's say, Wisconsin or Minnesota, you were likely to be Lutheran or Catholic. And if you were, in the South, you were, among, where there's more Baptists than there are people, you were probably a Southern Baptist, and so on. If you lived out in Utah, you know what you were. So religion, ethnicity, and geography are come together. It's what I call embedded religion. It comes with the territory. And in the book, I talk about a sense that I had, and I would like to hear what Marty has to say about his days in Nebraska. I felt like I was at the center of concentric circles of belonging. There was the street and the people on it. There was the neighborhood. There was the town that we kids felt like we owned, like seniors do in high school. They own the high school. that's the way we felt about the suburb that I lived in, was 11,000 people. My experience of being a Catholic was I belonged to all the Catholics in the parish. We went to church on Sunday. All the kids in the parochial school. When we went to a Jesuit high school, that became the church in a sense, and the parish less important. When we went on vacations and went to Mass at some church in some other state, those were my people too. And then, of course, there are those strange people called saints who've died and gone to heaven, and we believed were with God and looking down like grandparents on us from high front porches. So there was a strong sense of belonging in lots of different directions. Yours?
Well, mine will be very quick. I was in a little town in Nebraska, and embedded, we were half Lutheran and half Czech Catholic. And it depended very much where you lived, because the next county west of us were anti-Catholic Czechs. We would drive on Monterey Road, and suddenly we were County Road M, because they wouldn't allow. I have a picture in one of my books of the cemetery there. The anti-clerical Czechs wouldn't allow crosses on cemeteries. Great big sign out there. What we are, you soon will be. As you leave, what you are, we once were. That's a very cheery little thing. So we knew there wasn't any intermarriage among them. But let's get back. This is your book, so let's get back to you. What happened? What happened to the embedment? Is that what we should take it next?
What's that?
What happened to it?
Well, I would say this was boundaried, and there were limitations. Some folks didn't, as you suggest, didn't talk to other folks. I think the neighborhoods disappeared to a large extent. You have to have a neighborhood. Somebody's got to be home. If somebody down the street's going to know your name, some adult, the adult's got to be in the house where both folks are working now. So that's had an effect, I think, on neighborhoods. I think the change in the neighborhood, there's still some in Chicago. I was moving here, I was surprised at how tenacious the neighborhoods are in this city. I can't say, well, I talk in the end about, I can say what happened. Why it happened, I don't know. It would be different for mainline Protestants as it is for Catholics. Mainline Protestants began to lose membership for a variety of reasons, and one big reason being not having as many children as they had in the past. But by the end of the century, Catholics were and are in the same position. Little Catholics are not becoming big Catholics. They're becoming something else or nothing at all. And we see a decline along those lines. In the meantime, there were these sunbursts of religious enthusiasm that took place in the 70s and the 80s. And they're connected to culture and politics. I'll just give one example. Something you don't see today, but it's something that parents worried about a lot in the 70s and the 80s were the cults. Dr. Moon, the people that drank Kool-Aid down in Latin America and the rest. Yeah, it was scary, and it's tied to the decline of marriage in the family. As marriage becomes an option among many, cohabitation, serial marriages, and the one I like, starter marriages, you go into it knowing this is just a step in the right direction. As you saw the decline of the family, you saw kids from middle class backgrounds, high school kids, freshmen in college, leaving home. 1 million kids ran away from home every year in the 70s and the 80s. Where did they go? A lot of them ended up in the cults. They were looking for family, and they joined sacred families. So that's one of the things that did happen.
Now, another one that you talk about is the movement religion.
Yeah.
Well, the two fit together, but I'm going to get 2 years in a big hurry. If you're writing history of American religions, what I was doing, you always were busy in those years. It wasn't hard, you know. I wrote 3 volumes on 20th century religion. Right up to 1960, you could keep track of everything. And then you couldn't anymore. And you keep learning new things. I was, to show how it isn't all in Manhattan or Chicago or somewhere, I was speaking at Bowling Green, Kentucky, Western University. Somebody raised their hand, what do you think of the Unification Church? I gave about a 10-minute lecture about church unity and the ecumenical movement. His sister had joined the Moonies and keeping up. But you're going to move it to movement.
Well, yeah, the one thing, one of the big sections you book is about the movement religion, starting from civil rights movement all the way through the anti-war movement, and covers some of the most interesting characters. So, including Abraham Joshua Heschel and Richard John Neuhaus and the Berrigans. So what's the movement religion?
Well, there were a lot of movements that had the energy and the belief system almost of religions, and the behavioral and the belonging took place. In embedded religion that you receive from family, etc., where you live, as I said, was important, and the denominational label was important, ethnicity may be important. Movement religion is the opposite. If you look at King's civil rights movement, you may have somebody who's a Unitarian from Lowell, Massachusetts, you know, a Catholic from Chicago, a Lutheran from someplace in Minnesota, and where they were from didn't matter. What denomination they were didn't matter. What mattered is you were with the movement. And the sense of movement, the very word itself, meant you're moving with history. You're being prophetic, a much overused word, at least in my judgment, in those days. And to belong to the movement was a primal identity. It was also a time when Marty, because he's the first one I remember, he's a great noticer. He notices everything, so be careful. But what he noticed, was everybody was suddenly announcing their identification, their new identity, the new cause, on their T-shirts. And I wore regular T-shirts when I was a kid. It might have said the Cleveland Indians on it or something like that, but it wasn't a cause. Well, people began to identify with causes, and you were either with the movement or you weren't with the movement, which brings up the case of the Berrigans. I think we were all enchanted by the Berrigans, partly because Dan Berrigan was such a great poet, and the religious support for the anti-war movement, that movement grew out of the civil rights movement. So the movement had a kind of, engendered a kind of commitment to it that was religious, and in many cases, it was a religious commitment.
Mike Royko, our great columnist, once wrote, a kid came in with some literature, wanted him to join something, and Royko said, you know, you look a bit familiar. I think I saw you out at Michigan Avenue protesting in 1968. Oh yeah, I was a weatherman then. And he would write down the list of all these things. And then I saw you at something. And Royko said, well, aren't you ever going to settle down? Yeah, sometimes I think when I grow up I'm going to be a cowboy. Which was his satirical way of saying that you didn't have a center. And I think that's what you track so well in this book. What do people do? You quote Chesterton, when you stop believing in God, you believe in everything.
Right.
And Lifton coined the phrase the protean man, protean human being. Could be a different shape every day, but then you have to ask, who is the person?
Now, tell us a little bit about Heschel. You spent a lot of time with
the only
Heschel
person in the book really who doesn't come under criticism from me is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And yeah, I pick at all kinds of people here, but Heschel I couldn't. First of all, he's 30 years older. What I learned of Judaism, I learned really under him, and I learned a heck of a lot more besides. I mean,
he gave me a cigar once in a hotel in Israel, and I didn't smoke, but I didn't want to lose the chance, so I smoked so I got theology.
I remember, well, I used to go up to his room, and he had these books like, well, the stalagmites sticking up, and he was a very short guy. You couldn't see him behind the books. And they put him, I mean, he was world famous but not at his own seminary. And they put him in a room which wasn't bigger than a men's room there. And I was kind of shocked at the way they treated him. But I remember Heschel and Marty together because right after Vatican II, they had a series of Vatican IIs and a halves, which is to say all the luminaries, Karl Rahner and Kung and all these guys, would come and they'd go to the divinity schools, or they ended up at Notre Dame for a conference. And Marty was to sum up the whole conference at the end. So he sat back with the journalists writing a series of lectures that you were to deliver at SMU. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Okay. So he's not even out in front. Well, during this whole thing, Heschel gets up. He stood up. This is the center at Notre Dame. And it's a good thing he stood up because you wouldn't have seen him otherwise, and you could hardly enough see him anyhow. And he said, looking at all these famous theologians made famous by Vatican Council II, and he said, with all due respect, gentlemen, the people are asking for bread and you are giving them stones. And what he meant was too abstract, too, in a bad sense, theological. Heschel always spoke out of a sense of wonder, which he wrote a lot, a sense of awe. He was a Hasid, after all. And he was wondering, and Hasids tell stories. Well, anyhow, Marty did a fine job. He came up, I don't know what he was doing while he was lecturing, but he heard what everybody else was saying because he gave a wonderful summary at the end. And that's when I thought, I got to get to know this guy.
We go back.
Yeah, we do.
Well, maybe you can tell your story of how he had a secret information because you got into the Vatican II sessions, right?
Oh, yeah, well, it's a quick little, I want to hear you mainly, but these,
Go ahead.
these come to mind. Okay, I was a Christian Century magazine based in Chicago, and I was a young guy with it, and I should grow up ecumenically, so every summer they'd send me somewhere, and along came the third session of Vatican II. So how would Marty learn about it all? So I went, scared silly. There are these 6-hour sessions in Latin every day, and we all have to wait till they translate it in the press room. I got off the plane, got a ride in to the Vatican, a hotel, Via del Conciliazione, and somebody said, you're Martin Marty. I want you to meet the Bishop Bartholomew of St. Cloud, Minnesota. The first bishop of St. Cloud, Minnesota was named Bishop Martin Marty, OSB. Anything I can do for you? I said, yes, a little black book. And the next morning, from his room came the same kind of things the bishops got. So I got to every session I wanted to go to. And enjoyed it.
Back to Berrigan, though. I had a bit of crisis of conscience because I was a critical admirer of the man. The guy had guts, but he was playing the inspired imp after a while, having the FBI chase him around and so forth. And he and his brothers tried to sort of sacramentalize and Catholicize the anti-war, the clerical anti-war movement by pouring blood on
Draft files.
And all of that. And they felt that anybody that wasn't with them, even within the movement, was somehow lacking. So there was a really unseemly arrogance about the two of them. And then it came out when I reviewed his autobiography in the New York Times. I think the Berrigan after the anti-war protest, the Berrigan who went, volunteered and worked in a hospital for terminally ill AIDS patients and changed their chamber pots and their clothes and did that sort of thing, was the Berrigan who I really would have appreciated.
He got soulful.
Yeah.
S-O-U-L, soulful
Yeah.
in your terms.
And then I think the other one was Richard John Newhouse. And Richard John was Lutheran. Did you go to any of the schools that you went to? Did he study at Missouri?
Same place 10 years later.
Same place 10 years later. He was at the '68 convention here in Chicago, and he was protesting with who's the black comedian?
Dick Gregory.
Dick Gregory. He was knee deep into it, and he gradually became disenchanted with his, you might say, left-wing views. I think it was the Roe v. Wade that made a big change for him. He moved to the right, but he was still in movement religion. He even created a sort of movement magazine in First Things. So the personality didn't change, and that's another way of saying you can have movements on the right as well as on the left. So that's, if you get religion that way, what happens when the movement, as all movements do, becomes exhausted? That was the case, I guess, what I'm saying about Berrigan. The movement exhausted itself, and he carried on in a different direction. Richard did. And when I spoke to Heschel, prominent as he was, and it was a real concern for a lot of Jews in this country, because when a Jew gets identified with a movement like that, there's always a fear of anti-Semitism coming in reaction. But when I talked to Heschel, we never once mentioned this civil rights movement, anti-war movement, all of that kind of stuff. He wanted to talk about God. And
That's the question I was going to ask. Where's God in all this stuff you're talking about?
they thought...
Is that in the agenda? Good, let me...
Put me on the spot here. They thought God was in the movement. They thought that this was the future God was revealing to them. There was that whole period, you remember, that God will show us. God will set our agenda. We'll be quiescent, and therefore the war, the opposition to the war was a kairos, opening a movement, a revelation, and this is what we should be doing. So very often the positions they adopted on social and political affairs ended up being considered at least revelations for God. And I think that's a rather dicey thing, or a revelation from God, and I think it's dicey to look at this. But then there's another kind of religion that I talk about, entrepreneurial religion. And this is my phrase for evangelical religion. There is, and Martin, you can say something about this, because you know more about it than I do, the connection between free enterprise capitalism and the rise of evangelicalism, probably in the 19th century. This identification goes back to. Am I right in that?
Most of them invoke Max Weber, who said that the Protestant ethic was you had to prove that God had called you, and you did that by working hard and earning more, et cetera, and accumulating. And that became a big part of it. And then it got secularized, but then along came modern evangelicalism, which picked that up. And very often people, they weren't well off necessarily, but they really bought into the ideology of it.
I saw it in Omaha, Nebraska, the FCC, it was during Kennedy's time. The FCC came out to look at Omaha and what it did with local live broadcasting. All television stations were supposed to allow free time to religious groups, and they gave it to the mainline churches aligned with the National Council of Churches. They gave it to the local Catholics, and they gave it to the Jews. They didn't give it to the evangelicals. So the evangelicals found that they had been frozen out of free time. What they did is buy time. And then when the free time was withdrawn by the FCC, they had all these channels, both on radio and on television, and they owned them. There are many ways in which they're entrepreneurial in a way. If you were Jerry Falwell, you went to seminary and you got out, or Bible school. I think it was a Bible school. You didn't become a local pastor, or assistant pastor. You didn't start up that way. They threw you out there, and you had to start your own church. And so they tell stories of themselves. I went out, and he was in a Coca-Cola factory, and he started preaching. People came to him. This is proof that God was behind his enterprise, and he built up. He became the biggest employer eventually in Lynchburg, Virginia. Billy Graham started a tremendous organization, and he did. There are little details you see in people like this. I come from a family. Both my brothers and my father were salesmen. And I had to go out and do a cover story on Billy. It was back in 1970. And we did do a cover story. And I went out to see him in Los Angeles. And I took the I took the red eye, and he picked me up in a green car. He says, Ken, the dealer gives me this a free car to use anytime I come out here. Wonderful, Billy. All his assistants were dressed in green sport coats like he was. So it was like a Southern football team where everybody's wearing the colors. And he gets out of the car, we're going to go do the interview, and he reaches in his wallet and he pulls out, he shows me a card from the Marriott Motels, Billy Graham, World Evangelist, in raised print on the card. And he said, you know, Willard Marriott, he's a Mormon, but he gave this to me. He said, this means I can go stay for free in any Marriott hotel or motel in the world. Now, I knew from listening to the family, salesmen love their perks. And Billy was better known than Willard Marriott was, yet he had let me know that he got perks from people like this. I also had to notice, I was a little concerned. It was Sunday. I thought I should go to church, as Catholics do on Sunday, and wasn't going to make it. But I find out that Billy doesn't go to church on Sunday when he's on the road, and he's on the road most of the time. And when, like a lot of people, like young Bush and the Clintons, when he's home, he goes to his wife's church, Presbyterian. Actually, he was Presbyterian way in the background, the family was. Anyhow, but he wasn't going to make church, and he didn't get there. So I'm talking to him, and I'm watching him watch himself edit a tape of one of the crusades he gave. This is a wonderful long story. I'm not going to go into it in the book. But Billy, I said, well, Billy, you know, I thought maybe he's editing himself. I could have done better here, whatever. It was just a crusade that was attended by Richard Nixon, by the way. There were politics involved here. Anyhow, so I said, Billy, what are you thinking when you watch yourself preaching? And he said, I don't see myself there preaching. I see that person up in the film, and the Spirit of God is speaking through him. So he listened to him. I figured, well, Billy's been to church after all.
I hope we're not giving a wrong impression. All these people, huge egos, huge everything, and so on. There's a funny side to it all, and a lot of that comes out when we chat like this. But I think Ken is very fair to them. It's hard to be fair to everybody, and you were a little hard on young Berrigan and a few others. A little hard on Methodists, I don't know why.
Well, they wouldn't let us drink on Sundays and get liquor when I was growing up. Okay.
But I think
and you talk a little bit about the transformation of Billy Graham from his travels in Eastern Europe, and talk a little bit about that.
Well, Berrigan transformed. Billy did transform. He became a very different person. He used to go to India, and he was talking to the Christians in India, basically. He would go there, he would pay no attention. There was nothing that he had learned from Indian religion. There was nothing he had learned from Buddhists. He wasn't going to learn from anybody. Then he went to Eastern Europe, and he was so happy to get there. And that's where he met John Paul II, the future John Paul II, by the way. There he met, really, though, were Christians under the gun, toughing it out in communist societies. And he told me, it came to him, these people were more truly Christians than the people he knew back home. So he no longer talked about America being a Christian country. It's a country that had some Christians in it. I think that was a real change. He then began to focus more and more on the outside world, that is to say, going around the world, than he did in this country. He no longer got himself involved in politics, and in fact, apologized for it. I remember one of the things, he wakes up one morning and finds that the Polish cardinal he was supposed to meet, but couldn't because the guy got called to Rome because they were going to pick a new pope, and who'd they pick but this guy? And so Billy was watching him come out on the balcony of St. Peter's, and he said, first thing he said was something like, Christ is the answer. And I called Billy, doing the cover story on the new pope, and I said, Billy, what do you think of this guy? He said, he's an evangelist. He's an evangelist. So it took one to know one. John Paul II was a lot of things. He was a philosopher, he was a geopolitician, he was a lot of things. Billy was right. First of all, he was an evangelist. And then Billy said, when they wouldn't let the Pope go to Russia, but they let Billy go there, Billy said, I think they took, I was the second best. I was the second guy they asked. And he really became very, it was a new attitude, I think, towards Catholicism as well. He's one of the great figures of the 20th century, no question.
I'm going to keep bringing this to us all the time.
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit about the people you like. Heschel, John Paul II,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. They were as Billy
Yeah.
Graham. They were as at home in the world as anybody. They skied. They were John Paul II.
Yeah.
They knew everybody and everything of that sort. And yet, you admire them. And if I had to think when I read the book, they were anchored somehow. They were no longer embedded. You couldn't stay there. You're on the road.
Right.
But they knew that to which they had to go back every day and every night.
I found this, and I learned this from Heschel. One time he met Merton, and they got in a taxi in Louisville driving back to the monastery, and they had pleasantries for about a minute and a half. Then they got down to real business. Now these, and they modeled for me something that I found out in my own work to be true, which is that people who go deeply into one tradition are marinated in the tradition, formed by the tradition, are much more likely to understand somebody from another tradition. And that was an example of it. I found in doing my work, I'm meeting people, I talk about the circumstances when I first met Mormons, and they talked about the Mrs. God and all of that, the God being married and so on. But I found that if I drew on my own personal commitment to and through a religious community, namely the Catholic Church, I better understood the other people who were there. We almost connected. I remember first time I went out to the Orthodox Jewish section of Brooklyn. You needed a visa to get in there. I mean, it's such a different place. And I immediately, because they're halakhic notions, things you didn't do, how the everyday was penetrated by the divine. I picked that up because of my Catholic sacramental sensibility, and I got along much easier with them than I would say Unitarians, for example. So when you report, you've got to draw on your own sense of commitment if you are to convey to the reader the commitments that other people have and why it's important to them. It's easy to do with other Christians, but it's a lot harder to do with Hindus and Buddhists. And as I stayed at Newsweek longer and longer, I had to do religions around the world. But we haven't gotten to the question of politics yet.
Yes, we wanted to move on to the connection between entrepreneurial religion you make and the founded in the moral majority. And how did that take place?
That's in your subtitle, isn't it? Culture, ... and politics.
Yeah, religion,
Politics makes it in there.
faith, culture, and politics. Politics makes it in there.
I think it's interesting that a judge is calling us into the civil realm now.
Well, what really happened was this. Jimmy Carter gets elected president, and I think this is fair to say, Marty, a lot of fundamentalists and very conservative evangelicals voted some for the first time. They weren't it was too worldly to be politically involved. Also, this was the year that Chuck Colson wrote Born Again, a big bestseller. Jimmy Carter said, I am a born-again Christian. Said this to the Washington Post reporter who thought it was a new cult. Didn't understand born-again language. We did a survey and found well over 50% of Americans said they were born again too. And not all of them were Southern Baptists.
And just an interjection, you tried the experience yourself.
Oh, well, yeah, I did go down to get myself saved at a Billy Graham crusade one time to see, what it
That was your journalist obligation to
I felt like
experience
that.
it.
Yeah. I guess they didn't like me or something, but it ended up being very bureaucratic, and you had to fill out a form and all this kind of stuff. But I thought somebody was going to come over and get down on a knee, and have me confess on the floor, and I guess I was happy that I didn't have to do that. But anyhow, so it's Jimmy. By the way, Jimmy Carter. Newsweek editors couldn't get enough of the Carters. They did Jimmy, of course, several times. They did Billy, the beer drinker. Some of you are old enough to remember, with Billy on the cover. We put his mother, Miss Lillian, on the cover. And finally, they asked me to do his sister, Ruth Carter Stapleton, who had her own ministry. And so it was a mix of the sort of Southern Baptist religion and the new therapeutic sensibility. But the people who created the moral majority was not Jerry Falwell. It was two Catholics and a Jew, Richard Viguerie, Paul Weirish, and Howard Phillips. And these were operatives on the right side, very conservative side of the Republican Party. And they thought they would, they needed somebody like Falwell. Falwell had, what do you call it, a mail?
Mailing list.
What do you call it?
Direct mail mailing list.
Direct mailing list. He had his own jet to fly around in, and they named it the moral majority, and they picked him to run it. And that's how it began. Falwell and Billy did not get along. At a certain point, Falwell got real hubris and decided he would displace Billy. He was going to take the jumbo jet of renewed fundamentalism was going to overtake the Billy Graham-style neo-evangelicalism, and even met with editors of Billy's magazine, Christian Century, to talk about Christian. I'm sorry, Christian.
You're close.
I'm close. He wrote for Christian Century many years.
Christianity Today.
Christianity Today. They did a good job of the various groups of creating the Christian right. So for the first time, people who really stayed out of the political realm decided to organize. They used the churches to organize, like African Americans used the black church, and because it's the only institution they had. And they came with cleats on, coming in to vote. Now, we're all Democrats, aren't we, with small d? We all want more people to vote. This is a democracy. Well, a lot of people wish they'd just stay away, as a matter of fact. And it really changed the constituency of the Republican Party. I remember Bush Sr., right after he was nominated for president, he was vice president, had to go to one of these religious roundtable hoedowns of these kinds of people. And you would have thought that that he had woken up from a dream at Yale and discovered he was at a Bible school instead. He was just very uncomfortable, and it just weren't his folks, but they had to swallow these folks. So the conventions took on a different cast, a different kind of people that didn't coexist well with, East Coast Republicans. And eventually, in both parties, there was no longer a liberal wing of the Republican Party and no longer a conservative wing of the Democratic Party.
And why don't we move on to the Democratic Party, because you talk about the Methodist moment, which I was totally unfamiliar with.
All right, well, this takes a little explanation. Marty says I don't like the Methodists. It isn't quite that. Besides, there's different kinds of Methodists. But in any case, the Democratic Party today, my argument is, just as the Republican Party today isn't the party that had both Goldwater and Rockefeller in it, the Democratic Party is not the same party, in my judgment at any rate, as the party of Roosevelt, Kennedy, Johnson. And the turning point, the transformation occurs 1972 as a reaction to what happened here in Chicago at the '68 convention, and particularly, the image of Mayor Daley cracking down and his police cracking down on the anti-war protesters. And so, and as Bill Clinton has written, it wasn't just the anti-war protesters. Every hippie and yippie and all kinds of countercultural people were here. It was quite a show and quite a mess on television to see. So they created a commission. They've been trying for a number of years. They created a commission under George McGovern, senator of South Dakota, to restructure who gets to be represented at the convention and so forth. And it shifted in favor of a whole new set of people, away from blue-collar workers, away from union heads, because after all, these people were perceived as being on the wrong side of the war issue. It shifted away from the big city bosses like Daley or the state party bosses, many of which were Roman Catholic. And in favor of, and they also had quotas, the young, racial minorities, and women. Even set up a quota for women. So the people that came to the convention were different, and they were better educated by and large. So who did they nominate? Well, they nominated George McGovern. Who was George McGovern? George McGovern was the son of a Methodist minister, raised in a Methodist manse, went to a Methodist
See what I mean?
went to a Methodist college, decided to become a Methodist minister, came here to Evanston and preached that summer in churches. Then he decided to become an academic, went back to the Methodist college to teach until the state party called on him to revitalize a almost defunct party. So what I did in looking at it, I got a suggestion of this from a man Steve Tipton, who had written a book on the Methodist Church recently. And reading that book gave me an idea. In any case, I went back and looked at the 1972 meeting of the United Methodist Church. They meet every 4 years, about 3 months before the national political conventions. And theirs is like a political convention. It lasts 2 weeks. They have caucuses. They have floor fights. They have trading of votes, trying to get the other people's votes. And they pass resolutions on everything imaginable in the public sphere. Moral issues, yes, some theological issues, but a lot of them political issues. And I looked at who won those, what the resolutions were. What did the Methodists want politically? Because they printed out in their book of resolutions. And I compared that to the Democratic Party convention, the platform that year. In some cases, word for word. Now, I'm not saying they stole from it or anything like that. It's that the mindset was the same. The outlook was the same. The passion and the call for change, systemic change, and so forth. So that began to, well, what happened? Well, McGovern won Massachusetts, and that was it. But it brought, I'm trying to look at the phrase. It was, what was the phrase I used on that now? It's
You quoted the pastor from Park Ridge. We'll tell you.
Well, we have a contemporary surfacing of the Methodists, right? But
well, yeah, I'm trying to say, but there's a certain moral high-mindedness, but also a sense of we know it's good for you. After all, the Methodists did give us prohibition through the women's temperance movement. It wasn't just that, but largely that. But that sense of taking responsibility for the whole of society and getting it in ship-shape. That's what I take as sort of the Methodist attitude. It didn't continue under Carter. He came from a totally different kind of tradition. But you can see it in the Methodist Church building, the only non-governmental building on Capitol Hill. And that's also the place where the other mainline Protestant churches have their Washington lobbyists. And so when Hillary Clinton comes in as First Lady and is handed the portfolio to to change the healthcare system. She has stacks and stacks of papers from the Methodists who had been working with Teddy Kennedy all these years on what it should be and what a proper care system would be like. Then when I interviewed her in 1994, I had been trying to interview Bill Clinton, who gave us, after all, as his slogan, the New Covenant, right out of the New Testament. He was a Bible-toting Southern Baptist who had a brush with the Jesuits at Georgetown, as I remember. I had been trying to interview this man, and they wouldn't let him do it. But just before the midterm elections in '94, they gave me Hillary instead. So I interviewed her, and there's a long story about it. It's a pretty funny one, but I don't want to go into all the details. But during the course of this thing, I asked her, I said, look, you're not going to be in the White House forever. Have you ever thought, well, maybe she will be after all. But I said, have you ever thought of, you've preached at Methodist conferences and you were a Sunday school teacher, have you ever thought about becoming an ordained minister? And she blew it. I think about it all the time. And then she looked at Liz Caputo, her press agent, went like this, and she said, you can't use it. And I thought, holy shit, excuse me, but, you know, I could see the headline in Newsweek. This would have been, well, it didn't happen. We did run the interview for a long time.
He asked her what's her favorite book in the Bible. And years later, I'm at the White House, sitting next to her at a dinner. And she turned to me and said, now about that column you wrote about me, I wrote a lighthearted column. Martin Luther, she said, James, the Epistle of James, her favorite. And Martin Luther wasn't sure it belonged in the canon of the Bible. Yes. It was all works, no grace. And so I pretended, how will the Lutherans ever get along with the White House people? And the person next to her, I won't say his name now, said, well, I don't have that problem. She said, well, what's your faith? Well, I was brought up Southern Baptist, but I'm not anymore. And there's nothing more ex than an ex-Southern Baptist. And then she asked him, what's your God? Well, nature's my God, God's my nature and stuff. And she went on with this thing. And finally he said, well, at least we don't have a goddamn canon. And she said, yes, you have a canon. I've been listening to you, David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Annie Dillard, Wendell Berry. She went down the list. But I even got drawn in on your column. You created trouble.
Well, you know, I asked her on inspiration. I said, okay, Hillary, people don't think you're a religious person. Do you believe in the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit? I catechized her right there in the map room of the White House. I was surprised that I got away with it. Well, all right, I will tell you the story. What happened is when I walked in, she said, can we turn, I put out two tape recorders because this was going to be a big story. I had a very short turnaround time on it. I want to make sure I got it. So I put the tape recorders out and she says, can you turn them off for a moment because I want to get to know you a little bit. I understand that, but all of a sudden I'm empowered by the First Lady of, she's nervous and I'm not, and I haven't been inside the White House. So we talk a little bit, and then we go on and we do the interview, and I get through this interview, and I get some good stuff in here, even though she won't talk about wanting to become a Methodist minister. And guess what? I never turned the tape recorders back. And I thought, my memory's not that good, never has been. So thank God for the White House taping. The one that brought Nixon down, it saved my butt, I can tell you. So they had taped it, and they sent me the transcription of all this sort of thing. So it was her youth minister from Park Ridge who had said, we Methodists know what's good for you. And he was being, he was having fun with his own tradition and acknowledging this propensity to tell other people how they should live. And so that weekend, Bill Clinton took the editor of Christian Century and these other editors of religious magazines to Israel with him on Air Force One. And he passed around the Newsweek to them and asked them what they thought. Well, I don't know what they said, but he ventured that there was only one sentence in there he didn't like, and that was from the youth minister saying, we Methodists know what's good for you. but I think he already understood that Hillary had a problem, an attitude problem that, with the people she was trying to work with. So that's my venture into religion and politics.
We have 5 minutes for questions.